Well, it's terrific to be here. I think this is not only a great honor in itself to be the Sir Douglas Myers Visiting Professor, but also to just have the opportunity to come here and spend time in New Zealand and enjoy your beautiful country and interact with some of the academics and policy people in Wellington, and not to mention people here at Auckland. So this has just been a great opportunity for us, and we've really enjoyed this. So I want to begin by talking about Joseph Heller. Joseph Heller, one of the great American novelists, wrote this novel in 1961 about World War II called Catch-22, the term coming into the lexicon of at least American English. This is about young men who are going on bombing missions, flying in bombers during World War II, and it's high risk. Planes are being shot down. People are nervous and afraid, and some in fact go crazy, and it's about this. And so here's what Heller talks about the beauty of Catch-22. So he says that there was only one catch, and that was Catch-22, which specified that a concern for one's safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind, or, who was one of the pilots, or was crazy and could be grounded. All he had to do was ask. And as soon as he did, he would no longer be crazy and would have to fly more missions. Or would be crazy to fly more missions and sane if he didn't. But if he were sane, he had to fly them. If he flew them, he was crazy and didn't have to. But if he didn't want to, then he was sane and had to. You can see the nature of the logic of this. And I'm going to suggest something similar is at work when it comes to development. Developing countries have a problem that's very much like this. Which we call the violence trap, and I'm going to talk about that. So Adam Smith, often thought of as the father of economics, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, asked the following question in the book. The book is largely about this, and that is, what accounts for the very different levels of opulence across the countries of the world? Why are some rich and some poor? And in particular, why are so many countries remain poor? Well, it turns out this is a question not only of great interest in Smith's day, but also in our day. And in fact, you can ask the same questions today that Smith did. We can also add one, and that is, why has $1 trillion in aid from places like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, why has so much money led to so little success? Well, there are many problems and many theories of this. Some people argue that developing countries are missing things. So, for example, they have bad policies. They're missing the idea of knowing what to do. And so economists can step in and say, well, don't do what you're doing. That's really bad. Do something else instead. Another one is that they lack capital, that rich places have lots of capital, and we invest and get returns on capital, and having a lot of capital also raises the productivity of labor, and so that's why we're rich, and that's why poor countries are poor. So what we need to do in that case is simply give them capital. Another theory has been education, human capital as it's called. We need to educate them. Good governance was another. And incumbent risk also that is, politicians themselves don't like the idea of, they're worried about being worse off, and if they make choices that make development more likely, that makes them as politicians, incumbents, worse off. Well, one of the interesting things about this list is that it's gone serially. In terms of, there's a historic ranking that this is a time sequence, not just a set of independent issues in terms of theories. And the reason why economists and development people have gone on is because they're concerned about the fact that the previous theory didn't work. And so advice on these ideas simply doesn't produce development. So one of the questions is why? So a secondary question is, why does development advice not work? Well, I argue that the real problem is the violence trap. We'll explain that in a minute. This is something that I developed, the first part, the idea of importance of violence, with my colleagues John Wallace and Doug North in a 2009 book called Violence and Social Orders, where we talked about the importance and prevalence of violence for development. In subsequent work with Gary Cox, Doug North, and I, we've actually formulated the idea and formalized the idea of the violence trap, which I'll talk to you about. And one of the things I want to emphasize for you is that we in the developed world have the luxury of living in a world where we don't have to worry about violence on a daily basis. And you can see where 9/11, an event like 9/11 changes that. And were there multiple events like 9/11, one every 3 months, the nature of Americans' relationship to violence would be very different. But luckily, that's been relatively isolated. And what we fail to see is that freedom from violence is a relatively novel thing in the world. It's something that needs to be constructed, and that most places are not like that at all. And that in order to understand the problem of developing countries, and in particular the failure of development, we need to know more about violence and how countries deal with the problem of violence. So here, another illustration. I want to give you the essence of the violence trap in another way. So Thucydides is one of the great theoretical historians from ancient Greece, talking about the war between Sparta and Attica, the Peloponnesian War, which led to disaster for Athens. And one of the things Thucydides says, and this is adapted from Josh Ober, one of the great students of classical Athens, Thucydides says, to survive, a community needs walls for protection. But walls require money. How do you get money? Well, there are two basic ways, trade or plunder. But to do so, that is to do either of trade or plunder, you need ships. Well, to build ships, you need to have walls, because without walls, you have insufficient protection to do something that takes as long as building ships. So here we have a slightly different form of the catch-22 logic, something we'll see again over the course of the talk. So there are two basic ideas I want to build on. The first is that violence is endemic, that is, violence in the developing world. One of the things we show is that the median developing country experiences violent takeover of the leadership in their country, say a coup or a civil war. The median country experiences it once in every 8 years. So this is something that's actually quite prevalent in the world. It turns out that for the top 10% of the world, which differs from all the rest, the median number of years between violence is on average 60. So it's much different than this. So the NWW, that's my abbreviation for North Wallace and Weingast, our thesis is that every country has to solve the problem of violence. And one of the keys to the puzzle is going to turn on organizations. And the key difference is the way to think about organizations is can you go form an organization? So all of us in the countries we live in can go form corporations, for example, whether for business purposes or for soccer leagues. And we can do that in a relatively easy way. We don't have to really go get permission to do that kind of thing, in the sense that we need an act of a legislature or the blessing of the right politicians or bribing of the right politicians. That's called open access to organizations. Other countries have limited access to organizations. And this is part and parcel to the nature of limiting the way markets work by making it difficult for people to form organizations that compete. The same holds for democracy, that is, organizations that compete for political power. So this is a key aspect, this concept of whether you have limited or open access to organizations. So here's the key theoretical insight. We argue that states, developing countries typically have a distributed access to violence. It's not just the state that has access to violence. There's lots of other groups in the world, in most developing countries that have access to violence. And so the natural state, we argue, is the natural way to solve these problems. We call it the natural state because most countries over time in history have formed of this way, and most states on the planet today are still of this form. And the basic idea is that states create rents. That is, they manipulate markets and create privileges for individuals, say give them a monopoly on the local beer factory, so that in a particular city they get to make all the beer and earn monopoly rents from that. But one of the things that the reason why countries do this, we argue, is because the nature of violence. If the rents are targeted to individuals in ways that is proportioned to their political power, that is their political violence power, then you can get people to cooperate by virtue of having the rents, as long as the rents are more valuable than fighting. And so you can get a degree of peace of this, but this has a problem, and over time, over time, natural states affect shocks. And so they can go into violence, and so that creates a problem. I'll explain a little more about that. Another important principle, though, that I want to say, and I'll tell you more about this in a minute, but I just want to flag it here, is the idea of what we call the proportionality principle. This is the idea that more powerful groups, that is those with greater violence potential, need to have more rents and privileges. The reason is if they're more powerful, then what they get, their expectation of what they'll get if they fight is larger. And so in order to make them better off not fighting, you need to give them more. Now what this means, of course, is that things are very personal in the natural state. That is, personal in the sense that that who you are really matters. This is very different from the developed world where individuals where we have citizenship and people have impersonal rights. They have rights by virtue of being citizens, not because they know the powerful guy down the street. Okay, and the violence of trap is an important feature of this, and I'll speak more about this, but one of the things that makes it work is that part of the way in which developed countries solve the problem of violence is the idea that they create economic integration. And the value of economic integration politically with respect to violence is that it makes it more costly for the different groups to fight. So for example, in the United States in 1815, the South, where slaves are, produces the export crops, cotton, sugar, tobacco, that kind of thing. But they don't produce any of the services associated with getting this to market. So the markets are typically in Europe, and it's the Northeast that provides these. They provide the ships, the transportation, the insurance, the marketing, the loans to the farmers during the time they're producing this. And so all of that is done, and there's a specialization and exchange process here. Over time, this becomes much less important to the to the North. As a matter of fact, as the economy grows, there's so many, the markets expand so much that the importance of this market for the North goes down tremendously, and so the costs of fighting the South, in fact, go way down. I don't want to suggest that's the entire reason for a civil war, but it's certainly a factor in the Civil War. All right, so here's I want to proceed as follows. I'm going to give you a little data on endemic violence. Don't worry, we're not looking at statistics here. We're going to talk about elements of the developing country environment. I'm going to give you a bit more of theory, not much more. I've hinted at all the key concepts so far. And then we'll actually see the violence trap and how that works. And then we'll develop some implications for democracy, the rule of law, and why reforms typically fail. Okay, so here's some evidence on regime duration. I've said this before. The idea had to do with how long does a regime last in power in a particular country between periods of violent takeover. So as long as a regime takes over power through nonviolent means, whether elections or not, the regime we count as continuing. On the other hand, if there's a coup that takes power through military might, then the regime ends. And so the question is, how long do regimes last? And so what we're doing is looking at the 50th percentile here. That means we're looking at the median country in the category, and there are 3 categories of interest. Oops. So one category is the poorest half of the distribution. Then there's the richest 10% of the distribution, and then there's the richest developing countries there. And notice what the numbers are. So this is the number of years. So the poorest half of the distribution, that is half of all countries in the world, experience violent takeover once every 7 years. Whereas if we look at the richest, the answer is 60, so a very big difference. And if we look at the richest quartile with the richest decile removed, I'm going to redo this so it's simply the second decile, a little easier to understand. The idea is there, it's 12.5 years. In other words, violence is still really prevalent, even in the richest developing countries, and therefore they have to worry about taking violence into account in the nature of their politics and economics. I think I said all this. So I want to focus on two features of developing country environment. One is the idea of distributed violence potential. I've mentioned that already. So think about Mexico. Mexico is one of these richest developing countries. It's in the second category. Mexico and Brazil are called middle income countries, not literally because they're in the middle of the distribution, which they're not. They're still on the low end, but because people don't want to have simply rich countries dominating rich countries and poor countries. So Mexico, one of the richest. So think about the way in which violence is distributed there. There are the drug lords who manage a major portion of the country. And there's no pretense that the government has power and authority in those areas. Similarly, labor unions have the violence potential. They have the potential to disrupt the economy. They've taken over states and shut down states where they haven't gotten their demands met. There's the Pemex, which is the oil company, the state-run oil company, which for years had its own private army to defend itself. And of course, there are the native peoples in Chiapas that have their own use of violence. So right away, in one of the richest countries here, 4 different non-governmental sets of actors who have access to violence and will use it. In other countries, such as Argentina, Brazil, Thailand, South Korea, it's the military. The military takes over through coups with some regularity. More recently, we've had the Arab Spring, which new kinds of potential for new hope for these countries that were all authoritarian. And of course, what we find is ex post, 2 years later, we have instead of having promise emerged, we have new forms of violence. So in Egypt, Libya, and Syria, they're all either authoritarian or violent. Another thing that's important is shocks. So shocks have to do with the way in which the world changes. Sometimes they are sudden. You can think of a shock as the earthquake in Christchurch, for example. Overnight, the economy is devastated. There are some that tend to be more slowly, like swings in commodity prices, or differential growth. If you have 2 different parties that are potential fighters in a country that potentially might fight each other, one grows more faster than the other, then that changes the nature of the relative power and is a form of shock. The discovery of minerals is another one that often wreaks havoc with the nature of economies. Examples of the way in which this affects, I'll just give you a couple. Marcos in the Philippines. So he took power as a democratically elected leader in the, I think, late 50s or early 60s, I believe, and things were going well. But toward the end of his second term, things are going less well, and it's clear that if he has a third election, he won't win. And part of the reason has to do with, I think, people want to move on beyond this and want to move beyond the corruption. So he imposes martial law and suspends the nature of elections. And this works reasonably well for about a decade. But toward the end of the decade, commodity prices, which are so important for a country like the Philippines, they depend on products of palm trees, such as palm oil and sugar. And as those prices plummeted, his ability to spread rents around in the coalition supporting him diminishes. And so some of the key players switch sides. Marcos is one of them. And switch sides meaning that he no longer is giving them enough to support Marcos, and so they switch sides. Other examples are here. Putin in Russia, the way in which energy prices has changed the constraints on him. The same thing, Chavez faced the same in Venezuela, and Pinochet through taking power through violence in Chile. So the main point, though, to take home from this is that shocks change the distribution of violence potential, and therefore the nature of distributions of privileges and rents have to be reordered in order to maintain peace. And that process is not guaranteed to work well every time. So tactics to reduce violence. So how do developing countries, that is natural states, deal with violence? And here I reach back to the theory in the book. The answer is, we argue, is rent creation. So as I mentioned, somebody may get a local monopoly on beer or the ability to produce cement, the local monopoly on a bridge over a river and tolls. Monopoly on telephones is another favorite one for developing countries. Now, in order to make these rents work, there has to be protection of competition, because these are privileges that can be eroded by competition. And so, in order for these to work, privileges have to be backed up by several things. First of all, limits on the ability to form organizations to compete. That makes it more difficult for competitors to arise. And in some places, the privileges themselves require that nobody else can form an organization to do particular tasks. So in other words, these natural states are inherently limited access orders. It's very hard to form organizations if you're not part of the dominant coalition. And another is the substantial studies, subsidies and privileges. One of my favorite questions when I'm talking to people about India and people who've been to India is ask them, do you remember when you flew, what time you landed? And they say, oh yeah, we landed at 1 in the morning. I say, why do you think that was? Oh, I assume because traveling around the world, you kind of end up there at that time. Well, it turns out that's not the reason at all. It turns out that major foreign air carriers can only land in India legally between 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. and 4 a.m. There's one airline, however, that can land from other places during the rest of the day. Do you have a guess on what that would be? Air India, yes, exactly. So this is the nature. I don't mean to single India out. There must be 50 countries that have something very similar. It's just amazing how clever people are at creating these kind of rents in developing countries. So key insights. The key is that the rents have to make key individuals and groups with violence potential better off cooperating than fighting. Each player's rents must exceed what they expect if they fight. And failing to do so means that at least one of the groups is willing to fight and initiate civil conflict than not. And so the distribution of benefits, therefore, has to maintain or follow what I call the proportionality principle. I mentioned that before. The idea is that groups that are more powerful have to get more rents. And the reason is that their value of fighting to them is higher, and so they need to be bought off. The cost of buying them off is higher. This also means, because it's proportional to power, it also means that because it's proportional to power, it means that individuals get very different things. Who you are really matters. These are very personal places in the sense that the powerful get exceptions and privileges, others do not. So, as I mentioned, these states must limit access. They do so to protect rents and privileges. They suppress organizations, political, economic, and social. They even make it difficult to form social organizations. And part of the reason is that social organizations where they may be initially formed solely for the purpose of creating soccer leagues, but they allow people to cooperate and hence potentially threaten the state. And so the state is very nervous about organizations that are independent of itself. And in fact, many natural states are rigged so that every single major organization has some tie to the ruler of the ruling family. So this includes Mubarak's Egypt, Suharto's Indonesia, Hussein's Iraq, Nazi Germany. These are very common, where every major organization has to have some close political tie. And often they have a member of the family of the ruler that's part of their board, that is a key member of making decisions. And we see this again and again in the developing world. So here are 3 lessons. Lesson 1, natural states lack impersonal rights such as property rights. Why is that? Well, impersonal rights means that individuals have rights by virtue of being who they are, of being a citizen, for example. And the problem with that is it makes it hard to have privileges, because privileges require that you single people out. Privileges are personal. They require that individuals with violence potential get more than others. And so as a consequence, it's very hard to have rights. And so that's one of the really key failures of markets. Economists have long known that the nature of property rights and secure property rights are really important for investment and growth. Another key concept is perpetuity. That is, the idea of perpetuity is that institutions live beyond the lives of those who create them. So think about the difference between a partnership, a traditional partnership, and a business and a general corporation firm. So a partnership is personal. It matters who the players are, and in particular, when one of them dies, the partnership has to be dissolved. Now, it doesn't have to be all the assets sold. It can be sold as an ongoing firm, an ongoing organization, but each one has to be dealt with individually. Whereas in a corporation, corporations are owned through shares, and shares you have property rights to as an individual, and when you die, your heirs inherit your shares, and as a consequence, the corporation doesn't need to be reorganized. And so it's perpetual. It lives beyond those who create it. The same concept applies in politics. The question is, when a new leader comes to power, is there an expectation that the rules will remain the same? So when there's a new president of France, the new president comes with the expectation of following the rules. These are rules not of his or her devising, and rules that will live beyond typically his term or her term in office. On the other hand, in places like Russia, Putin comes in and he changes a great many rules that had come from the Yeltsin era. These are not perpetual institutions because they depend upon who is in office, and the next dictator is going to change the rules in ways that they find convenient. And finally, there's the idea of control of violence. Violence is important to control because natural states, as we have seen, lack this ability. It's very hard to have impersonal rights or personal rights if there is widespread access to violence. In contrast, as I say here at the end, open access or developed countries possess all three of those characteristics. They are part of the nature of development. So lesson 2, economists, when they look at countries, natural states like this, they see what they call market intervention. Here the government is controlling or manipulating markets for political ends. And we agree that's what the state does. The state manipulates markets for political ends. But we disagree with the nature of how to think about it and why that happens. So economists think that the market would exist naturally but for these market interventions, and so therefore everybody can be made better off by dismantling them. The classic problem of monopoly. If we take away monopolies and create a competitive industry, then the welfare of citizens goes up. That's standard economics 1. The problem is that this approach obscures the nature of the logic. If the logic is rent creation to solve the problem of violence, then rents in fact are doing something valuable. They're not simply useless transfers or negative sum transfers to individuals. They're actually serving a purpose of preventing violence. And so that means when the economists come along and say, we're going to do economic reform, we're going to make markets work better and dismantle these monopoly privileges, what they're really telling the country is, we're going to dismantle the features that make peace in your country. And as a consequence, they don't want to do it. So reform fails again and again and again. There are no great success stories in this business. Lesson 3, rent creation in the absence of markets. Rent creation, as the economists do say, with market intervention, rent creation does hinder the economy. And natural states fail to grow, that is, they remain poor, in part because of this nature of these policies. But they're trapped into them. It's very hard to get out of this because the whole reason that they have them is not simply greedy people. People are greedy in every economy, as we know. Rather, it's the nature of the fact that these rents are needed to produce peace. So, query, if a bargain satisfies proportionality principle and that we institute peace, why do we find violence? Well, violence occurs as through these peace can fall apart when there are big enough shocks. So I talked about various shocks before. What shocks do is they change the nature of the distribution of violence potential, and often they do in ways that are not clear to the participants. There's not what we call common knowledge. There's, to use another term of art, there's asymmetric information. And what all those terms mean is if the world has changed in ways that we both know I've gotten more powerful than you have, I may think I've gotten more powerful than you think I have. And if that difference is big enough, then the highest you're willing to pay me, that transfer me not to fight, can be below the lowest I will take not to fight. And so as a consequence, we fight. And so that's the importance of shocks, and that's why violence, that's why agreements that fit that satisfy the proportionality principle can't live on forever. Shocks are inevitable, and means violence is also inevitable. Okay. Now here's some evidence consistent with this theory. So what are we looking for here? We're looking for the number of years of peace punctuated by violence. So what I have here are the poor countries. We're just dividing countries into the poor half of the distribution and the richer half, not literally. This is this includes, must be about 80 to 90% of the countries, and this is about 10%. And we rule out states that are rich by this measure that are merely oil states. And so what do we find? Well, we ask how many years do they grow? What's the proportion of years in which they grow? What's the average growth rate? And in years where they contract, what's the negative growth rate? So take a look at the poorer countries. Positive years of growth percent is 66. So 66 years they grow on average. 34 years they contract. When they grow quite a bit. And in fact, as you can see here, when they grow quite a bit more than do the rich countries. This is sometimes called the advantage of catch-up. But when they contract, they also contract more quickly than do the rich countries. And moreover, they contract in many more years than do the rich countries. And so part of the reason we argue for this is that this is evidence of the violence trap. This is evidence that there's violence that causes the switch between a set of positive years of growth and a negative set of years of growth. So one of the ways of solving the violence trap is investments in economic integration. I mentioned this before, having to do with the early United States. And the value of economic integration is that it raises the price of fighting. So when there's economic integration across lines, groups that might fight, that is, they're making investments whose payoff depends upon cooperation, then it makes them better off, because it makes them less likely to fight, because the nature of fighting puts those investments at risk. But the problem is that at first, investments are vulnerable to violence. And so there's a tendency not to make these investments in the first place because there's too much risk. So that's the nature of the trap. Let me put this in other terms that are more familiar to the catch-22 logic. So there were, and forgive me that my prose is not as elegant as Joseph Heller's. So there was only one way to escape the violence trap, and that's by investing in economic integration. So people could stop the violence. All they had to do was make the investments in integration. But they'd be crazy to do so. The real threat of violence makes these investments too risky. Hence, people rationally do not make the investments. But the absence of the investments means violence. That, in essence, is the violence trap. It's very hard for poor countries to get out of this, and so poor countries persist in this equilibrium that is much less, that is a stable state, that is much less productive than the developing world. So I've mentioned this before. An implicit theme of the current approach is that developing countries are like developed ones, only less so. That is, they lack something. So one of the first theories about what they lacked had to do with capital, as I mentioned. That is, they lack capital and hence the ability to invest. And so if we gave them the capital, that would allow them to succeed. Well, that turns out not to work. Education is another, technology, democracy, rule of law, all of those have the same characteristic. They've all been tried. And aid to developing countries have been tied to these in various ways. And they don't produce any more development than any of the others. This is not a way, and part of the reason is these things don't work the same way. You may have a system that you call democracy that is of elections in Iraq, for example, in the mid-aughts, but it's not a democratic country in the sense that, say, New Zealand is a democratic country and has been one for decades. New Zealand has perpetual institutions. It has impersonal rights. You have rights simply by virtue of being a citizen. There's much less problem with violence, and so New Zealand, as well as other developed countries, are very different in this. Well, consider a country that's trying to create an element of the rule of law. So rule of law, what is the rule of law about? Well, it's many things, but one is its impersonality. That is, it treats people alike. Citizens have rights by virtue of being citizens, not because they're powerful or not because they know someone who's powerful. They also have perpetual institutions. That is, they have institutions that live beyond those who created. They live beyond the current ruler. They don't depend on the identity of the current ruler. And of course, there's an absence of distributed violence potential, because without that absence, powerful people can undo either of the first two. So absence of violence is simply a necessary condition for the rule of law. Well, as we've seen, as I've argued already, natural states cannot sustain these features. That is, natural states cannot maintain each of those three characteristics, and so it cannot create the rule of law. And as a result, decisions are not made with respect to justice, are not made with respect to principles. So one of the interesting things then is that all of developing countries, or most developing countries, have all the trappings of a justice system. They have things that look like courts. They have things that look like judges. The judges wear robes. They have chambers. They hear cases. They make decisions, they cite precedent. I mean, it all seems to look just like our system, except it doesn't work anything like that, our system. Our system is based typically on impersonality. What are the rules? What are the facts of case? How do they fit? Sometimes you ask the question, is the rules, the precedents inadequate for this case? If so, do we need a new one? The like, and so that's very common. Whereas in developing countries, what happens? Well, in order to get in that courtroom, something has to happen. Typically, and that has to do with the nature of personality. You have to bribe somebody. And sometimes the bribe is really easy in the sense that there's a fixed price, and you go and you pay that price, you get justice, meaning you get the decision you want. You don't pay that price, you don't get the decision. In other countries, in fact, it's very difficult to know even how to go through them. Every time you talk to another bureaucrat, there's another, in the judicial system, there's another constraint and another person to bribe and another thing you need. Oh, well, you have the signature of that minister, I see, but not this minister. Didn't you know you had to get the decision of both ministers? And in fact, didn't you know you had to get this one before you got that one? Oh, this is really bad. What does that mean? This is going to cost you more money. And so those are much worse systems of justice. So they have all the trappings of the rule of law, they just are not rule of law. The same thing holds for democracy. Democracy in the world has come increasingly to mean elections. Do you have free and fair elections? Jimmy Carter, our former president, is a champion of this view. And one of the problems with this view is it fails to embed the system in a way that has a chance of surviving. So they have elections, yes, but stable democracies, no. Most new democracies fail, and in relatively short order. Oftentimes through the coups that I've been talking about. Examples have to do with the recent experience in Egypt in the Arab Spring. The old dictator's gotten rid of. There's something of an election. It's not a very successful state, and the army moves in and takes over, and lo and behold, it's all gone. And this story is repeated again and again and again throughout the developing world. Kenya is another of my favorite examples in the seeming to create democracy in terms of elections and lots of open access and economic reform, and seems to be a poster child for the standard wisdom. And then there's an election at the end of 07, 08. Forgive me if it's 08, 09. It looks like the incumbents are going to lose, and the incumbents have lots of advantages by virtue of being incumbents. They have access to public lands that are very valuable, for example, and they decide they're not going to give up power. And it all ends at that moment, and this is very common in developing countries. So what might be done instead? Well, instead of focusing on economic reform in terms of the nature of markets, that is, policies that I've suggested, an approach that involves, as I've suggested, dismantling the nature of the institutions that provide peace. Instead of focusing on that, focus on issues that raise the investment rate in economic integration. Outsiders can help do that by in a sense, subsidizing those where private actors are unwilling to take a chance on investment because it's risky, that can be subsidized by outsiders. And if they do that, then they'll have more of that economic integration and incrementally raise the cost of fighting. And in some areas, that will be enough, I think, to at least trigger some degree of growth and some degree of weakening of the logic of the violence trap. I should also say there's no miracles in all this. So here's an example, Iraq, something deeply associated with my country. And we can think about the way in which, how important the kind of issues I've been talking about by the amazing failures of the United States in Iraq. That is, to have these, what now seem to be fantasies of what might have happened had they actually gone into Iraq and taken over as they did. That is, things were supposed to work really well, and they did not. They, in fact, have, to this day, as you know, are not working very well. So one of the things that might have occurred earlier, it's not something that would in any way work now, but one of the things that might have worked differently is there were three groups in the beginning, the two groups of Muslims, the Sunni and the Shiites. And then the Kurds in the northwest of the country. Instead of creating elections, which arbitrarily allocates a lot of power to a small group or to coalition of a group against another, instead rigging it so that each of the three groups gets a share of the oil rents, but their share, the amount they get, or whether they get their share depends upon whether or not they cooperate. So those that violate certain kinds of terms and start to be violent in particular ways lose their stream of rents. And so that conditions the maintenance of peace on receiving rents, or conditions the receiving rents on maintaining peace. And I think that if these kind of mechanisms are thought through, then the probability of violence can be made significantly lower in these countries, and they can have a much better economic climate so that economic investment takes place more naturally. So let me briefly conclude. I've said, I think you've heard this more than once from me. Absence of violence is a luxury. It's not natural. Violence is a problem for all developing countries. That's why there are natural states. Natural states address these problems differently than do developed countries. Rent creation is a feature not of simple market intervention in greedy people, but rather to serve a purpose of reducing the likelihood of violence. Rent creation of this form necessarily hinders economic development, and transplanting institutions from what we call open access societies, that is developed societies, simply doesn't work. That is, simply taking the institutions that we have, such as rule of law or democracy in elections or markets, simply doesn't work. So I've said this. The problem of development, this seems anticlimactic putting it here, the problems of development are much harder to solve than economists think. So let me end there.